My name is Beth Moore Milroy, and I am the middle daughter of William Dyson Moore and Dora Casement Moore. My parents, were living all the time, pretty much, in Montreal until 1966, when they moved to Mascouche, to Moorcrest, actually. My grandfather came from England, from Lincolnshire in England. He was an orphan. He had no parents. He had, as far as we know, no siblings. And he came by himself on a ship, and we believe it was in 1900, arrived in Montreal. His first night he spent at the YMCA, which was located at that time in 1900, exactly where the Sun Life building is now in Montreal, on what was then Dominion Square, but which is now Dorchester Square. Then he just went, his first step the next day was to go out into the street and look around, and the first place he saw had a sign in the windows saying, looking for an apprentice hairdresser. And he went in, he got the job, and that's how he took on a trade. So that's my grandfather. His name was John Moore. My grandmother came from a different part of England, from a little further north than Lincolnshire, and she came in 1906. Both of them were born, by the way, in the 1880s. So when she came, she was just in her early 20s. And I believe they knew each other somehow or another back in England. I don't know how that happened. Or else they met very quickly. No, we think that they knew each other. And they married soon after. So she came 1906, and they were married in 1907. And then my father, first child, was born 1908. Compared to my grandfather, my grandmother had lots of siblings. She had 7 of them, actually. And so I think my grandfather thought he'd come into a mother lode. He'd really gain something here. And they became very interested in helping my grandmother's siblings come to Canada. And in fact, 4 of them did, 3 sisters of my grandmother, plus 1 brother, and then a niece also came. And they built housing that allowed for stretching it so that they could support these brothers brother and sisters. So that's how, a very poor immigrant family started out. In real estate, basically, right? I mean, that's how they made their way along. So there's logic to where my father went, and possibly me. So as I say, he was born in 1908, and I think, in Montreal West. I think he went to the local school there. I don't think he stayed in school more than a minute after he was legally allowed to leave, which at that time was 14. You had to go to school until you were 14. And then after that, he soon after, he joined as an apprentice hairdresser in my grandfather's business. This was very traditional at the time, that a father would start a business and expect their eldest child to join and then take over when the father retired. So that was all a very standard process. But he did it somewhat, I think, reluctantly, and that I take from later actions that I'll speak about later, maybe. But he liked to drive around a lot. He had a car from a very early age. And he used to drive mostly down to the United States. So from Montreal, it was easy to go to Vermont, New Hampshire, Upper New York State, down the eastern seaboard, Maine, and and Massachusetts, and so on, Chicago. So he did a lot of that. I know of no trips that he took to Ontario. I think he was mainly interested in the United States. So he did a lot of that, and in the process, I think he was gathering some of the ideas that he spoke about later. For example, he very much liked the Green Mountains of Vermont, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and in particular the cabins, the log cabins that they had there, which then he conveyed into Moorcrest, because that was what was built there. He also liked the little villages and how they were set up, and the structures and that type of thing. So I think he was taking in all of that, but I think he was also wandering around quite a bit in Montreal, where there were the early examples of what's called the Cité Jardin, or the Garden City movement, with a particular structure of streets and that kind of thing. So we can talk about that later. My memories are quite mixed. My memory of who my dad was he was a very complicated person. He wanted a lot out of life. He could be very charming. People were always telling us how charming my dad was. And so he had a charming face for the world generally. And he didn't beat us or do anything, like that, but he was very strict, very rigid with us as children. He lived in a house of men, largely. He had 3 brothers, so there were 4 boys. My grandmother was the one who carried the whip. That's the expression. I mean, she didn't, obviously, literally, and my grandfather was working all the time on all these, like, building things and his business and, and the rest, just trying to make money. So he didn't, I don't think he had a sense of how to be a father, actually. It wasn't a skill that he had learned in his home. And so he didn't know quite what to do with it, and least of all with girls. And he had 3 girls. He had no sons. So he tried to treat us a bit as if we were his boys. And we took it a bit, but objected a lot. For example, my older sister, for the first Christmas that she was old enough to actually receive a gift and understand partly what it was, she was 3, he gave her an electric train. And an electric train was a standard gift you gave a son, the first son that was born. So she got an electric train. Later on, I received a baseball bat, a ball, and a mitt. So he was projecting quite a bit onto us. So you can imagine that created a certain tenor in the home, and so we had a lot of clashes. So in 1944, when he bought about 100 acres, a little more, 110 acres, something like that, of land, the landscape was forest, farms that had been cut out of the forest, the Mascouche River, slightly hilly, very sandy soil, clay, the bridge over the river, the scenery. And Mascouche, which was a village, I would say the population may have been 300 people. I mean, it was very, very small at that time, maybe fewer. So it was truly a little French-Canadian village that was wonderful for us. We loved it. Every house built right up to the road. The baker was in a house in the front parlor, like my grandfather had his salon in the front room. Monsieur Duval, the baker, had his bakery right in the front, and you went in his front door and you bought the bread and you went out. So we loved all of that, but that's what, it was very tiny. It was then called, the formal name was Saint-Henri de Mascouche. It was the paroisse de Saint-Henri de Mascouche. So there was very little in the way of regionalization or rules about anything. There were almost no rules. There were rules about buying property. Everything was done very carefully with the notaries and that kind of thing. So my father went through all that process. But once that was done, he had a free hand. He could do anything he wanted on his 100 acres. He didn't want to have a farm. You know, he didn't want to leave it as forest. He wanted to use it in some way. And his idea was that he would build something that would be nice for Montreal families, people with children, to come for the summer and spend the summer in the good air of Mascouche. So he brought to the development of Moorcrest certain key ideas. One had to do with the roads and the road structures, and roads for any city planner, that's first, that's what you have to deal with first. And so if you go and look in Moorcrest, you'll see something interesting, I think, which is that off of Chemin Pincourt, there are two roads going off of it. One, Northview, which was the first one that was built, and the other one, Moorcrest Drive. And those are cul-de-sac. There is no way out of those roads onto Pincourt, you know, onto Chemin Pincourt. And that was very intentional because my dad didn't want people coming through and then using it as a shortcut to somewhere, or causing danger to the children on the streets, because we always played on the road and things like that. He just wanted to be sure that those were streets, from the children's point of view, was this, and the women, because there were only women and children in the settlement during the summer, right? Because the fathers were all down in Montreal at their work. So he just wanted to be safe, and so that is quite unique. I mean, there just wasn't a place like that. So instead of the usual grid structure, which we see, you know, in most places, there were these cul-de-sac. Another thing was that he wanted a certain coherence in the settlement. So he developed rules which were used in some places, but not much in Quebec at that time, of setbacks, what's called a setback. So a setback from the road. So there's the road, and then there has to be a certain number of, at that time, feet going back from the road to the beginning of the house. Then side yards, as they're called, and there had to be certain side yard depths on either side of the house. So you had to situate your house where it wasn't too close to the neighbor or too close to the road, and then that gave a certain amount of coherence. He also established minimum lot sizes. Now, minimum lot sizes didn't come from the Cité Jardin. This was something he did, and that was because you had to have a septic system and a well. And that was because, of course, we weren't connected. Moorcrest wasn't connected to Mascouche or any services. Those services didn't go out of that little village, right? So, so that's why they needed to have that. But it was also a contributor to another point from Cité Jardin, which was that there should be a lot of room for trees and flowers and gardens of whatever type. So that he's setting up a kind of a sense of an avenue, in a way, on these cul-de-sac. My father's being the designer of the place, the real estate agent of the place, and the manager of everything, the owner of the roads and all that kind of thing. He sold only to families, only to people who had children, preferably in the age group that fit what was already there. So I mean, he was the gatekeeper par excellence. But we had a lot of fun. I mean, we had bonfires, and roasted marshmallows. We looked at times when we would look at the northern lights when they were bright, and which you could see there were no lights around to disturb the view and so on. So it was, and as kids we played all sorts of games all day long. So it was a wonderful, it was a wonderful place. So in so many of those respects, while he borrowed from the Garden City, he added on his other pieces. And as far as I know, there wasn't another place like it, The Jardin Moore came about late in my father's life. He was well into his 70s when he started that. He had really finished what he was doing with Moorcrest. He was no longer allowed to be a real estate agent because he didn't have a license in Quebec, and so they caught up with him, decided they cut him out of that work. He had sold the roads to Mascouche, and so he was basically finished with that. And the one thing he had left was a big piece of land, which was the other park, down near the Mascouche, coming up from the Mascouche River and up a slight escarpment. So he decided he wanted to do something with that, and that he would turn his mind to that project. And it took him quite a long time to figure out what he was going to do, but he finally settled on a garden, and we all gasped because my father was not a gardener. My mother was, he wasn't, and we couldn't figure out how he was going to do it and all the rest of it. But my father, when he got an idea, he didn't let go, and he would find a way to actually make it happen. So when the house that was up above, which was one of the original log houses in Moorcrest, half siding, when that went up for sale, my parents, who were living on Moorcrest Drive, decided, well, it was actually my dad, decided to buy that in order to be closer to the garden so he could watch over everything and be more involved, and it was more convenient than having to move, not very far, but a little bit. So they bought that, that property, sold the other one, and then lived there for a long while. Then towards the end of his life, very close to the end of his life, he came up with an arrangement that was masterminded by Richard and Denise largely, and himself and lawyers and all the rest of it, to turn over the house and the land to the Fondation, and then he just lived there for free until he actually died. So all of that was given to the Fondation, which was operating very well, and today has, it had a bit of a dip for a while, and there were fears that it was all going to be sold and so on. But there, Denise saved it, literally. It was Denise who did that because Richard had already passed away. And now there's just a superb board of directors running the Jardin. So Tony Huber, who had become his friend, he actually he created a new iris, and it is called the Dyson Moore iris, or the Iris Dyson Moore. And my father was very, very pleased about that. I mean, he felt very good about it. But it also was a tribute to his mother, who was called Nell. Her real name was Lois Ellen, but Nell was a very common way of shortening Ellen. And Nell's favorite flower was the iris. So in a way, it all comes back. To the end of his story comes back to the beginning of his story with his mother.